After World War II, W.H. Auden wrote a poem titled "The Age of Anxiety," in which he dealt with anxiety before the tranquilizer revolution. Since then, many folks have wondered if that title doesn't aptly describe the era that many of us live in now. We're an anxious people. World War II made us realize that the whole world could be blown up with a push of a button. COVID made us realize that disease can spread over all the world. Psychologists and scientists have made us realize the extent of anxiety as they have given us terms and diagnoses that make it clear that for some people, anxiety is a physiological condition. It comes with who they are. It comes with their bodies and their lives. Age of anxiety may indeed be an appropriate label for our time. Today, this congregation is celebrating its 160th anniversary, which means that our ministry, as we have pointed out many times before, had its origins during the Civil War of this nation. Now, I suspect that we have every right to think that we live in the age of anxiety, but wow, can you imagine what it was like to live during the Civil War? Can you imagine the anxiety that existed then? We were killing one another. Yet a faithful group of Norwegian immigrants courageously formed a faith community called the Scandinavian Lutheran Church because Muskegon needed a Lutheran witness to the gospel, which ultimately is about addressing the anxiety that plagues all of us. Whoever wrote the portion of Isaiah, which is our first reading for today, must have known a lot about anxiety. Some people think that this text was written to address the anxiety caused by the Babylonian invasion in 587 that flattened Jerusalem and the temple. Other folks think that this text from Isaiah was composed at a later time when the exiles of Israel were being invited to come back home only to discover a devastated, ugly Jerusalem. Who knows for sure its context, but what is for sure is that this author knows all about anxiety. And the era that he is addressing is an era of anxiety. Today we hear in words addressed, I think, to the prophet himself, "Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong, do not fear." Now, literally the text says, "Say to those with racing hearts." Speak to those for whom the adrenaline is pouring through their bloodstream. Address those whose muscles are stimulated, whose blood is flowing, whose pulse is elevated, whose thoughts are sprinting, whose metabolism is in high gear. Speak to those for whom fight or flight seems to be the only way. In case you haven't figured out, a lot of angry people, a lot of fighters, are anxious people. They look and they act mad, but truthfully, they are phenomenally anxious. And fighting is the way they know how to handle their anxiety. On the other hand, flight is how some people deal with anxiety. They simply run away. And by the way, sometimes you do need to run away. Sometimes you're in a position that you're a lot better off just to get the heck out of there. Flight is sometimes a necessary coping mechanism, but sometimes flight is simple avoidance. I'm just going to take my toys and go someplace else. I'm going to hide. I'm going to disappear. Anxiety often causes us to want to run. Well, to those who are running away, those who are fighting, those whose hearts are racing, the prophet speaks a word from God: be strong, do not fear. Why? Because your God is here. Here is your God. For 160 years, we've been proclaiming that. For 160 years, we have been claiming that God truly is the interesting thing. The most interesting thing, the most reliable thing, is the God who made the heavens and the earth, the God who is forever. It is this God who says, "Fear not." It is this God who speaks to those with racing our hearts, who are tyrannized by anxiety. And to this God belongs the real power of life. Now, it's very interesting to me how the Hebrew Scriptures deal with the God of power. And there's no doubt the Hebrew Scriptures deal with a God of power. Often, and we see this in our first reading and in the psalm that we sang today, the God of power becomes the God of vulnerability and justice very quickly. Right after the "here is your God" promise comes a picture of a transformed world, a world made right, a world where the eyes of the blind are open, the ears of the deaf are unstopped, the lame are leaping like deer. The God of power, who is worthy of our trust, is the God who stoops low to embrace the fragile of the world. To this God, people with disabilities truly are significant. This God keeps this God's eyes focused on the overlooked of the culture. Now, the psalm writer says something similar. After warning us not to be preoccupied with politicians, with people in positions of power, he speaks of God executing justice for the oppressed, God lifting up those who are bowed down, God watching over the stranger, and God upholding the widow and the orphan. God has a special place in God's heart for the neglected, for those whom the anxiety that comes from living such difficult lives and from being left out in the culture is especially poignant. God, who created it all, we are being told, is vulnerable, is near to those who suffer, near to those who are often forgotten, near to those kept at a distance. One kept at a distance shows up in Jesus' world today. A woman. That's pretty important here. A Gentile. That's real important. A Syrophoenician. That's really, really important. That is a foreigner, a member of one of the great enemies of Israel. This is who shows up in Jesus' world today. Now, this woman doesn't appear to have any disabilities, as does the deaf man who we will encounter in our gospel reading for today, but she is deeply anxious. Deeply anxious because she has a sick, demon-possessed daughter. And you know what mothers are like when their kids are suffering. They are like dogs with a bone. They are not going to give up until they get what they want. And what does she want? She wants healing for her daughter. And Jesus doesn't seem to care. You know, I really think it's amazing that Mark allowed this story to be included in his gospel. Honestly, Jesus doesn't look very good today. He doesn't seem particularly compassionate. He uses an ethnic slur, dogs, to describe the Gentiles of whom this woman is a part. Come on, Jesus, you can do better than this. We Christians say that you reveal to us who God is. Well, your prejudice doesn't look very good on God today. But you do seem willing to learn, and especially from a foreign woman. A foreign woman is teaching you today. Listen to what Jesus says today. For saying that. That's a very important line to me. For saying that, for speaking words of persistence, for teaching me, you can have your way. Your daughter is well. Jesus learns from a woman whose heart is racing. Maybe the goal in life is not to know it all. Maybe the goal in life is to be vulnerable enough to know that you need to learn, and even Jesus has got something to learn. He can see more clearly now because a foreigner with a racing heart dared to take him to the deeper places, dared to remind him that what his whole life was about from the very beginning anyway. And what is his whole life about? Well, the love of God that breaks down all barriers, crosses all boundaries, welcomes and unites all people. Jesus' life and ministry are now going to be changed because a Gentile woman, a representative of the enemies of his people, wouldn't allow her racing heart to be calmed until she got what she wanted. And what she wanted is what Jesus wanted all along, what his life was fundamentally about, what will take him to the cross and what will raise him from the dead. The love of God that knows no limit. Is your heart racing? Well, if you're living in the era in the land of anxiety, it probably is. And if you're anything like me, you're probably pretty good at adding to the anxiety that already exists because you know it's all about you. You've got so much to do. The kids have to have everything that they need. And if they don't, they're not going to become who they're supposed to be. Anxiety heaped upon anxiety. And we have a special word to those in anxiety. Listen to Isaiah. Say to those with racing hearts, be strong. Do not fear. Here is your God, a vulnerable God. A strong God, but so strong that this God can be vulnerable. Here is your God, a vulnerable God, a God of love, a God with a heart for the hurting and the suffering, a God whose love eventually will look like a cross, a God who is busy not tearing people apart, but bringing them together. Those of you with racing hearts, take a deep breath. First Lutheran, take a deep breath. All that anxiety, is it really necessary? Certainly doesn't make us better. In fact, it often makes us sicker. But hear the good news. Here is your God. Here is your God of vulnerable love. This is the vision. This is the message that began our congregation in 1864. And it is this vision and this message that we need to boldly trust as we move into the future. Happy anniversary, First Lutheran. 160 looks pretty good on you. And hear this. Here is your God, the God of love, the love that knows no limits. Amen.